Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to wait about one more minute and then we will get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. Great. Well, I have it at about 12:02, and so we will get started. And thank you again for taking time to join my partner, Congressman David Jolly, and I today as we talk about somewhat of the national and federal update, but more importantly, how it may impact business and you and your clients. So I'm just going to kick it off real quick with some of our Florida statistics. Many of you may know that we had about a 77% turnout, and we're excited about that for the state of Florida. About 4.7 million ballots were cast by mail. Half of those were Democrats. And between early voting and vote by mail, Democrats had cast more than 115,000 more votes than Republicans. But the shift happened on Election Day, certainly as we saw, with Republicans casting over about 840,000 more votes. And you can see that between the Florida House and the Florida Senate. The Florida Senate maintained Republican control, and then the Florida House picked up about 5 additional Republican seats. So I think what you will see between Speaker Designate Wilton Simpson and Speaker Designate Florida House Speaker Chris Sprowls, they will start to organize over the next few weeks with committee meetings, and with just coming out yesterday, committee meetings will likely start in January, with that December being the time to organize. So we're going to open it up to questions later as you have on that, and we'll get into more detail about what some of the Florida state agenda might look like for our businesses and for the economic impact as we go into our legislative session, which will be next March and April. But what we'd like to do is spend some time with David talking about the election, some of the paths, and then we are going to have time for questions. So if you do have any, please submit them to the chat and we will get those throughout the day. David, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Amy, and thank you for everyone for being with us. It's a wild week and a lot is still unresolved. I'll share a little bit about kind of where the election and results are. I know everybody's watching the news, so I won't belabor it. But then also I want to get to what Washington could look like in January, what that means for the business climate and for the advocacy climate for industry and so forth. Amy touched on the fact that in Florida, what we saw was a strong early vote by Democratic performing voters, and then a same-day election vote by Republican performers. For those in the Tampa Bay area, Pinellas County was kind of a perfect representation on election night, almost the first county to fully count their votes and to show that pattern. And that's been consistent across the country. But what you're seeing across the country is a result of when ballots are counted. So in Pinellas, you saw those early Democratic votes because of Florida laws were available to be counted immediately. And you saw Joe Biden and Democrats really stretch a 4 or 5 point lead maybe. And then as the same day ballots were counted in Pinellas and in Florida, you saw Biden make up that ground and ultimately win the election. In other states, what you're seeing is states where they were not permitted to count those early ballots on election day. So you saw Trump move up early because they were counting election day ballots where Republicans outperformed. And now you're seeing the trail of them counting a lot of the early ballots and mail ballots, which is why we're following the trend game right now. You saw Trump leading in Wisconsin and Michigan, but now Biden catching him. All eyes now are on the Atlanta metro area. Similar dynamic. Trump leading Georgia, but Biden catching him because as they're counting ballots around the metro Atlanta area. Pennsylvania's playing out the same way. There's a bunch of ballots in southeastern PA and the Philadelphia area that Biden should outperform. Would it be enough when those early ballots are counted to overcome Trump? That is a universal pattern we're seeing. Another thing we saw politically was Joe Biden did outperform Hillary Clinton of 2016 in the suburbs, a bit of a continuation of the 2018 performance we saw. Now, everybody can reach their own conclusion. We don't know what that means. Is it that the 2016 dynamic was different with 2 non-incumbent candidates? Is it that Biden is actually stronger in the suburbs? That's an assessment that anybody could make. But those are the political touches, if you will. What I would say for going forward, how does this all get resolved? And I know we have some attorneys on this call, and look, a lawyer's lawyer can dissect all these different cases. I would say, broadly speaking, where the world of law meets the world of politics, what we are going to see play out is Donald Trump trying to take control of the narrative. And this would be the same situation, whichever candidate is down. If you intend to really fight this, you've got to take control of the narrative. And you're seeing that deployed today in states across the country. You're seeing Trump deputies now trying to plainly articulate what their legal challenges will be, because they will be different in different states. I think at the end of the day, what all the data shows is that, we're in an 85% likelihood that Joe Biden secures the electoral votes necessary to be the next president. There is still a straightforward path, though a slim one, for Donald Trump, but that's without litigation. If either candidate, but in this case, it looks like Trump, decides to press litigation, there do not appear to be many kind of justiciable arguments he could make. I think what he would have to do is escalate his argument to a very broad one, that we can't trust the results in states because of widespread fraud. He would pick out anecdotal information and say, because of all of this data we're seeing, all of these incidents, anecdotal information of fraud, the legal move would be to prevent the secretaries of state in specific states from certifying the results. That's kind of the nuclear option that, as a nation, we would go through a lot should that be where we end up, including a large portion of the country probably deciding to question the ultimate result. But understand that results get certified at the Secretary of State level and then forwarded to the Electoral College and ultimately the House. There would be a legal mechanism to prevent certification. Whether he could win that argument or not, it is certainly doubtful among a lot of lawyers, but I think it's something that a candidate could test. What would it mean if this holds in terms of where things sit today? If Joe Biden were to win the Electoral College, the House, where Republicans actually picked up seats, Republicans had a very good night in the House of Representatives, including electing a number of new Republican women, and an African-American gentleman in Southwest Florida also elected. So Republicans feel like not only did they win seats, but they increased diversity of representation within their caucus. The Senate, where a lot of people expected Democrats to take control, they did not. Although, watch Georgia, as these ballots begin to come in Metro Atlanta, there is already one Georgia Senate race. There were two on the ballot today for some reasons of vacancies. There's already one Georgia Senate race that has moved to a runoff in January. It may be the second one does as well. So we all could be looking at Georgia in January, those two races, to see which party controls the Senate. A lot of variables in there, but let's say it all sticks where it is right now. Joe Biden president, Democratic House, Republican Senate. What does that mean for industry and for business? I would say two things to watch. It is likely a regulatory presidency for Joe Biden, at least in the first 2 years, perhaps the whole first term if nothing changes in the midterms. And what do I mean by that? There would be very little landmark legislation to pass. If you look at major legislation, it requires an alignment of the parties between the two ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. If you consider Barack Obama's Affordable Care Act, he did that while he had a Democratic Congress. And then he lost the Democratic Congress, and you saw the ability for sweeping legislation diminish. Donald Trump passed a major tax package when they controlled everything. When they lost it, you saw nothing the last 2 years. What can get done by an administration is very significant regulatory work that has direct and almost immediate impact on industry. For those who have practiced as attorneys for clients within industry, or if you're joining us today from industry, you know exactly what I'm talking about, from banking to the environment to labor to consumer protection. There are certain themes, broad themes within each one of those industries where the pendulum kind of swings back and forth between administrations. In banking, we saw changes between Obama and Trump when it came to capital requirements, when it came to stress testing, some rules around community banks. Trump implemented a deregulatory agenda. I think Biden would move back into the regulatory space and the environment around energy, oil, water in particular, and water, how it impacts a lot of commercial clients and commercial players, shopping centers, and so forth. In labor, the joint employer rules, if you are a business owner, a client is a business owner with multiple different entities, whether or not the administration, Department of Labor, aggregates those for enforcement proceedings in terms of labor and wage rules, I think you could expect to see all of those swing. And I would probably close with this. The most important relationship that may define all of this in Washington, D.C. come January is actually the relationship between Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer. Because if we are in a Biden White House, a Pelosi House of Representatives, and a McConnell Senate, the one dynamic that will be fairly consistent is that Joe Biden will feel the pull of the more progressive wing of the party that sits in the House of Representatives, that wants more aggressive, progressive legislation that you can imagine, from healthcare to taxes, environment, immigration, and so forth. But what we've seen in the past 2 years is whatever Speaker Pelosi gets through the House and passes to the Senate does not meet with the approval of McConnell. And on the must-pass legislation, while Pelosi's input is important, it really comes down to what McConnell and Schumer agree can pass the Senate. And so if you have a Joe Biden who's saying, look, I want to work with Republicans in the Senate, but he also has to work with Nancy Pelosi in the House, ultimately the arbiters of that entire dynamic as it impacts industry and business is going to be what deal can McConnell and Schumer get through the Senate, because past performance indicates that whatever McConnell and Schumer can agree to, ultimately Pelosi can get the votes in the House, and a President-elect Biden, if that's to be the case, certainly would sign. So look, the broad theme here, I would say, is if things hold today and we have a Biden presidency and a Republican-controlled Senate, look for a regulatory agenda that is very active in the first 2 years of a Biden term. If you sit within industry today, you probably know those themes, and if you are working with somebody to prepare for them, good. If not, Shoemaker certainly could be a partner in that. If you're an attorney that represents clients in that space, be aware that President Biden, should he be elected, will move quickly in that space, and an early indication of how aggressive will be the cabinet that he appoints. If he empowers people with more progressive philosophies in some of these areas with regulatory impact, it's an indicator it should be a very active regulatory first 2 years for President Biden, should he pull this out.
David, thank you so much. Certainly, we have all been watching the market also, and the differences. We've never quite seen how the market reacts to a presidential election like this, and positive.
Okay.
Do you envision, and what do you kind of think as we move forward? There's been a lot of talk about what stimulus looks like. Heard a lot this morning on a variety of, in what I read. Can you talk a little bit about some, you've been pretty right the last few rounds of stimulus, so I'd like for you to share with our listeners what you might project in your crystal ball.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Amy. And look, this is where politics, we all get to have certain value judgments, and I'm sure everybody on this call can make an assessment who they think is doing things right and who they think is doing things wrong. But I will tell you, I am optimistic that a stimulus package does get passed at some point. Look, the COVID numbers passed 100,000 a day yesterday. We're now at an all-time high. We're just distracted by the election. And so we know that the virus is continuing, and its economic impact, if we're watching the rest of the Western world, is significant. We're seeing more shutdowns and lockdowns in Western Europe and other nations. Should Biden take office, do we see a more aggressive approach to the virus that has an economic impact? Because if so, the pressure for a stimulus bill is going to keep pushing. I am somewhat optimistic. Optimistic's a wrong word. I can see a path towards a stimulus bill during the lame duck session. Part of that it will be determined by what does this election environment look like. Is this election going all the way till the second or third week in December? Because if so, there's probably zero legislative agenda that gets passed. Or is there an opportunity to move something? Congress does have to reconvene and reach a deal on keeping the government open. So the players will be at the table. And it may be in that package to keep the government open, we see an extension of some of the stimulus programs already passed. We see additional funding for some of the programs already passed. I don't know that we would see new programs. debates around some of these new programs for municipal governments, for school systems, and so forth. I don't see in a lame duck an appetite for new stimulus programs, but I do think a replenishment of depleted funds or an extension of the sunset provisions that might be in the original one. And I would go back to the McConnell-Schumer dynamic. The reason I feel comfortable saying a Biden presidency will rest on what McConnell and Schumer can reach agreement on is based on exactly this question, Amy, because the fight over the stimulus, look, the House has passed now 2 versions. The Senate says we can't get that through the Senate. And McConnell and Schumer have been unable to reach agreement on what they could get through the Senate. If McConnell and Schumer reach an agreement at any point, including in the lame duck, I think Pelosi has the votes for whatever that looks like. And Trump, depending on his status as the reelected or the outgoing president and what that means to his decision making, which is often unpredictable, I think it would seem he would sign whatever passes both houses, but that's a hard one to predict.
So we probably won't hear the old term shovel ready in this next round.
No, definitely not in the lame duck. But to that point, Amy, I think should Biden be elected, there is a lot he's going to propose, right? But there's an old saying that the president proposes and the Senate disposes. He's going to propose a lot of shovel ready, a lot of info. He's going to have a bold agenda because he naturally will want one, and he owes it to his Democratic base. But it won't be an agenda that makes its way through a Republican-controlled Senate, should the Senate hold where it is
today. Certainly, Florida had some shifts in our congressional makeup.
Yeah.
And would you talk about those? It's pretty fascinating when you see some of those numbers, and I think it came back to the fact that so many Republicans showed up to vote. Talk about those new elected officials there. And certainly, you mentioned a little bit of the pink wave that happened nationally. I think we experienced it in Florida.
Yeah, down in South Florida, 2 Republican women unseated 2 incumbent women Democrats. And we can wonder if part of that dynamic was the South Florida and Cuban Hispanic Venezuela Hispanic constituency that turned out for Trump as well was at a down ballot impact. But Republicans picked up a couple seats in South Florida. They held a critical seat in Central Florida that was thought to be at risk. Ross Spano, who was the incumbent Republican, lost his primary over what some would say were some ethics questions around some campaign finance laws. But that was an open seat. Democrats hoped to pick up. Republicans held it. And that's where I said at the beginning, Amy, we don't really catch this in the news cycle because we're consumed by the presidential race. Republicans are very happy with how things turned out on Tuesday night. Naturally, they want the White House. They want to continue to control the White House. But going into this, if you had said you're going to gain seats in the House and you're going to hold the Senate, Republicans would take that deal. We're just not hearing that narrative yet, but I assure you it's there and it's real. And I would translate it to a bit of a political observation, not to try to draw political opinions on this, but just an objective comment, if I could. A lot of people, I come from the Republican world, and a lot of people within the media and frankly around the dinner table have been suspicious of what the status of the Republican Party is under this president. He's been very disruptive, and we have all had this very intense political environment for 4 years, all of us, regardless of our involvement or not in politics. And there's been this question, what about the future of the Republican Party? I got it on a panel yesterday. How does the Republican Party regain its strength? I would say one thing coming out of Tuesday night is the Republican Party is performing just fine. It hasn't seen a drop off. If you look at presidential elections over the last 20 years, Republicans typically perform at about 50%. We see changes, right? Obama was a historical candidate that really shook up voter performance. But otherwise, you've seen 7 of the last presidential elections, Democrats win the popular vote by a few percentage points. Republicans hold the Electoral College here and there, but they perform at 50%. And so I think for Republicans coming out of Tuesday night, they feel very good. And for Democrats, I actually think there's a little bit of an assessment going on where they expected a mandate Tuesday night. They didn't get one. And if you look at the House of Representatives in particular, you could say, look, Democrats have a lot of work to do. So if we've been asking, what's the future of Republicans in a post-Trump world, I think Democrats are likely asking themselves the same question about their own party after Tuesday night.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And I think certainly Florida benefited in that. And back to just a little on the Florida House and the Senate, I did mention that in the Florida House maintained 78 Republicans. So some of the issues I think we can expect Speaker Designate Chris Sprowls and Senate President Walton Simpson to address. Certainly, they're, first of all, they're just committed to kids. They're both dads, and they're both building the base of just what do we do for our children in social welfare and in child care, I think education, but we can certainly expect the big discussions to be around economic, workforce development. I think I've heard both of them speak that is very important and a huge priority. So I think that is something we should all be looking out for, and how we play a part, how for our attorneys on the call and with our clients, how we're a partner in that and future economic initiatives. I think some liability reform, especially related to COVID, something we will see in Florida. I think you're seeing some of that already being talked about in other states too. Obviously, our state still does have a budget deficit. The September number is still showing, that's the latest report from the Governor's Office of Economic and Policy budget, is we're still in a situation that may last the next couple of years. Our reliance on tourism certainly is taking an impact, and I think those are the areas that we will continue to try to build other certain industries up. You know, manufacturing, we look in Tampa Bay, very big priority, and I think a big understanding that we have that presence in and throughout Florida. And the biohealth, always been important to Speaker Designate Sprowls, biosciences, and I think that is going to be another area that we need to be tracking very closely as we think about that decline, that increase. And we do still have the decline in tax collections, and I think that will continue to be an impact to us. I think September was about 6.5% to 7%, so hopefully those will continue to improve. Thoughts about that, David?
Yeah, well, and a comment to add, and maybe also a question for you, Amy. You know, the 22 cycle begins now, and I know we hate to say that, but Ron DeSantis is now entering his reelection cycle. There'll be a little bit of a honeymoon maybe until January or so, but and I had a conversation with one of his senior guys a couple weeks ago. I said, "Aren't you glad you're not in cycle this election?" Meaning this Tuesday's election. He laughed. He said, "Yeah, but it's coming." And so what does that mean for the legacy upon which Governor DeSantis wants to run for re-election? Does it shift policy priorities? Does it put a focus on some? This is a governor who was smart enough politically that after a very divisive race where he took a arguably very conservative bent, he came out with a kind of a cross-partisan appeal focused on the environment, focused on water, and got some pretty early high marks. COVID hit, the first session hit, you saw some of the true conservative convictions come through, which Republicans would say that's why we elected him. I do think there's a question, what Ron DeSantis do we see over the next 18 or 24 months in terms of setting a policy agenda in Florida ahead of his reelection efforts?
Well, certainly, and it is interesting because you only had half of the Senate that ran, the odd numbered ran, the even number of the Senate will run in 2 years, but because of term limits, they're always running. And I think that is part of what we as citizens and we as voters have to be so well connected to. And I think if there's one thing I've said on every group I've been on recently, and I had a chance last night to teach a group at University of Tampa, and I said, just tell me you all voted. So I think that becomes such the narrative too. And that's something that's important as we go into these next cycles. And that was the big, I want to digress a little bit on that, but the social impact that companies made across the nation in voting and pushing that as a priority. Everything from the Coke peach tea bottle or can to companies closing on election day so people can vote. So I think there were a lot of silver linings from Tuesday. I think there's going to be a lot more hope, certainly, as we move forward. So a long way of saying I think they're kind of always campaigning, and that will be a continued priority. To remember, the governor, the environment has been a huge issue now. It's for every Floridian legislator. legislator, I think, is willing to talk about it and at what level. Water quality. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that on the horizon. And First Lady DeSantis has put mental health as a #1 priority. And I think and I hope that you'll see that as a state priority too, because it is so important and never been more important today than before. We do have some questions coming in. If you can, anybody have a question, please send them in. This one is, Vice President Biden talked during the campaign about putting an emphasis, in parentheses, money into early learning. If Vice President wins, will there be money invested into early learning as a part of the incentive package? Before you answer that sort of from a federal, I just want to address it really from a state level too. I think there are so many initiatives happening in the early learning space, from United Way to PNC, companies that are spending a lot of time and energy, to the school districts who are trying to make an impact. Both the House and the Senate have paid a particular attention to that and have put money toward these programs in the last few years. So I think there will continue to be a great emphasis on what early learning means. And certainly I mentioned economic impact is our third graders have to be reading, and we do know that. So I think on a state level, you're going to see more initiatives, both grassroots and grass tops, revolving around some early learning potentials. But David, maybe address that from a federal level.
Yeah, it's a great question. I do think greater investment in education is an area where the president could find, a President Biden, should we have one, could find success, particularly in early childhood education and early learning. What might hold it up is if there are federal standards tied to it. A lot of people remember the standards that were tied during the Obama administration and so forth. And look, whatever the assessment was, the reality is it became a political issue that was probably a greater issue than it should have been. But I would be encouraged and optimistic that funding for education, we would see an expansion of it, even though the role of the federal government is more limited in scope than state and local. There are federal programs that support early childhood learning and investment in early learning. And I would say I'm hopeful based on my 20+ years working with the Congress. Republicans have been, though they often posture as kind of the budget cutters and don't go along with domestic spending, there are areas where they do, and this is one of those areas. In the last years of the Obama administration, early childhood learning, Head Start, other programs like that saw a significant upturn in federal dollars available. You saw it in the medical research area as well. Some of the greatest investments in medical research have come during Republican-controlled Congresses. So I do think an area that is kind of outside what I mentioned will be an otherwise tense regulatory agenda that will create some division. I think you would see investments in early childhood education blessed by both sides of the aisle. And certainly in an environment where we're looking for greater stimulus, perhaps you could move it into that package because of how it would shore up and change lives across the country. I do think that is something to watch, with the only caveat being if there is an education secretary that tries to revive a strong federal hand in how education money is spent, which could happen. I mean, that's the natural posture of an administration. They want to put their imprint on it. But if it moves more towards the policy debate, I think you lose the Republican support and you could end up losing the investment as well.
While we're waiting on a couple of questions, if you would also talk about Georgia, North Carolina, some other dynamics happening there. I don't know if Fulton County is in yet. I don't think it was when we started this call, 7,000 votes or whatever. There's a lot happening in those two states, especially. If you can talk about just those two and what you think may be next or when we might know.
Yeah, sure. Look, it appears North Carolina is done. It's just they're unable to certify it at this point. And North Carolina is one of those states where I think they're allowed to receive ballots as late as maybe next week. I think that's the North Carolina one.
The 12th.
Yeah. So some of these states,
right?
Yeah, some of these states, people are hesitant to call, but North Carolina largely seems done and in the Trump column. Georgia's the tricky one because honestly, if there are if Biden can run the table in everything but Pennsylvania, he can get to 270. And so that's why you're seeing Trump realize he's got to mobilize and hold some of these states. Nevada, I think, is down to about a 7,000 delta. What we are seeing in Georgia, though, is kind of that effect of which ballots are counted when that I spoke of at the beginning. Georgia, all the votes are in, but the mail and early votes around the metro Atlanta area. The counties that hold the largest number of votes right now are performing about 70-30 for Biden over Trump. And so a simple back of the napkin math about the number of outstanding ballots in those communities. And then if you say Biden continues to perform at 70-30, the numbers, now this is just a projection, the numbers have Biden passing Trump by something like 1,500 votes. So that's where the trend is in Georgia. Amy, I'll tell you what, even outside of some of the what would be considered historic litigation or challenges, their candidate Trump, right? Not President Trump. We have a system of federalism that controls our elections. The President of the United States has no additional authority than Joe Biden has in this case. But as candidates, they each have certain remedies within reach. And one of those is a recount. We could end up procedurally seeing recounts in 3 or 4 states, in Nevada, in Michigan, Wisconsin, in Georgia. And those recounts could take weeks. You know, most of the first recount procedures can be done in maybe 3 days to 10 days. But what we saw for those who lived through Florida in 2000, once the recount starts, it opens up a whole nother series of litigation opportunities, right? Which ballots are being counted? Why are they being counted? Which jurisdictions? So that's where in a more traditional environment, you may see a candidate concede as early as the next 48 hours, right? If all the states get called and it appears that candidate Trump would have to win challenges in 3 states, some candidates would say, no, I'm not going to do that. I do think what we know from this president is he's a fighter, and he is probably contemplating challenges in all these states, which would mean run out recounts for, let's say, a week to 10 days in 3 or 4 states, litigate upon litigate upon litigate upon them. And we may be in a position as a country where we have accepted that Biden has 270, but they're not certified all the way until mid-December before this thing gets sorted out.
And talk about that. What happens? Remember, mid-December. I think everybody may know it, but it's an interesting fact to talk about what happens in mid-December.
Yeah, there are dates when the Electoral College has to meet, and we get into a really arcane and often untested arena where this is where I say lawyers have very strong opinions about this. As a non-practicing lawyer myself who works where law and politics collide, I do see more opportunities for this to go really sideways. The ballots have to be certified by a certain date in early December, and then the Electoral College meets 535 people, and they actually cast their state's electoral votes. So if 29 electoral votes are coming from Florida, you have 29 electors that actually say Florida votes for Donald Trump. John Smith or Janice Smith, I cast on behalf of the state of Florida my electoral vote for Donald Trump because he won the election. So part of the litigation strategy would be, could you push this past that deadline in December? Because then we're in uncharted, well, I shouldn't say uncharted territory. We saw this in 1812, for those who followed the 1812 election, where we saw it kick to the House of Representatives. The nuclear option for President Trump today, not saying he would do it or not, and you would really have to thread the needle through a legal environment, but the nuclear option he could pull is if he can prevent certification by a sufficient number of states by December, win enough cases that say, yeah, this needs to be decided by the House of Representatives, all bets are off. And in this House of Representatives, despite the fact that Democrats control it, because of the way many of the procedures are set up, Trump actually goes into that environment as a slight favorite in holding the presidency should we get there.
Thank
So
you very
drink your coffee or your alcohol, whichever remedies that possibility I just shared. But that's the nuclear option.
through the holidays, through the holidays.
That's right.
We also in Florida had 6 constitutional amendments that were on the ballot, 4 of which received over the 60% required for approval. One of those was our minimum wage, and we did increase that. It should be increased over, I guess, 6 years now, or through 2026 to $15 per hour. For all these amendments, there were millions of dollars spent. Certainly a lot in that one, and a lot of information, a lot of flyers, a lot of commercials about it. But that is the way that the amendment reads, that it will be increased. Right now, we're at $8.56 an hour is our current minimum wage in Florida, and the federal's $7.25, I believe. So over the through 2026, that will be the plan. I think there's a lot of questions around that. A lot of vertical industries are curious about what that looks like. So I think stay tuned, but that is certainly one. Let me check our questions. What tax increases should we expect under a Biden administration? A lot has been talked about the taxes and what that looks like. It could come back to what you said about McConnell and their relationship, but what are you thinking and hearing, and certainly how is that engagement might fall out?
Yeah, look, I think this comes down possibly to what the 2 Senate races in Georgia hold in January, should that be the runoff, because control of the Senate could come down to those 2 races in Georgia. And what we have seen in the past, 10 years plus, is an obliteration of filibuster rules and supermajorities, a tax increase. They have a way through what's called reconciliation to pass it with just 51 votes. And even in a tied Senate, if a Vice President Harris controls the tiebreaker vote, they have it. So from a political standpoint, a policy standpoint, know that's what is at stake in control of the Senate. Because if McConnell and Republicans control the Senate, we won't see any tax package move that will increase taxes. What Biden's tax plan says is he wants to undo the tax cuts for people over $400,000 that were included in the Trump tax plan. I do think he will propose that regardless of who controls the Senate. I think that was a promise he made to Democratic voters in particular. But under a McConnell Senate, I don't think it will go anywhere. There's a question of what can he nibble at around the edges in fees and so forth. And then we saw something in one of the Obama tax packages where he was able to get Republicans to go along with an extra tax as part of, I think it was in the healthcare plan. There was something where I think they applied an extra 3% tax for income over $1 million, maybe. You may see Biden make some ground on that, even with the Republican Senate. I doubt it, but you may see the conversation move to something like that. Look, Biden, whether people can decide whether he's moderate or not, he's certainly to the center of where the left wing of the Democratic Party is. He owes it to his party, to the coalition that elevated him, to try to move towards a tax agenda that does hit high income earners. I mean, that is part of the Democratic platform, and so there's no reason to expect he won't try. I just don't think he'll be successful if the Senate remains in Republican hands. And Amy, I would also say, I mean, I hate to say, look at 2022, but we know the historical precedent. 2022 should be a very good year for Republicans if Biden wins office. Biden's aware of that. Biden will be trying to keep the House in 2022 if he's a first-term president. And so he's going to have to balance how aggressive does he get with a traditional progressive Democratic agenda, or how much does he try to pull that back to get through the 22 election and hopefully maintain the House and possibly then pick up the Senate for Democrats.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. To be determined, but I think all those are very valid as you think about the next 2 years. We had a question on the independent, and I'm not affiliated with any party. The NPA voter is a growing force in Florida. Absolutely. So I believe we have over 14 million registered voters in Florida. 24% of that is not affiliated with a party, and the non-affiliated votes came out to vote in person more on Tuesday than Democrats. So very growing. And the question is, how do traditional Republican and Democrat Party policymakers connect with us? And what do you see as the impact of such a growing NPA number? I personally believe, and we've seen it grow so much in the last few years. I mean, it's gone from 10 to 12 to 14 to now 24%. I think it's only going to grow. I think it's going to grow as Florida demographics change. Certainly a younger population, I think, tends to rotate that. You know, there's a national debate about open primaries and when and what that looks like between when Republicans and Democrats and independents vote differently than they do now. I do believe that it's hard for Democrats and Republicans. I think they very easily speak to our NPAs, and I think it's going to be more and more. What are you seeing nationally, and comment also on Florida on that piece and what it looks like for the future?
Yeah, look, we're seeing a growing NPA movement nationally, but let's focus on Florida because it's kind of a leading test bed for this. 40% of new voter registrants are rejecting the two-party duopoly, and they're choosing no party affiliation. Based on the current trend, by 2030, Florida will be one of the few states where independent voters outnumber Republican and Democratic registrants. What the parties will tell you is, look, you might be an independent, but you often perform as a consistent Republican or Democratic vote, right? We saw additional independent voters on Tuesday, but ultimately they performed in a 50-50 fashion. I think that's a generous assessment, but it didn't move us from a 50-50 election. What I will say, as a defender of the NPA movement, as one myself who's part of it, often independents perform as Republicans or Democrats because there's not a viable option for them to choose otherwise. And so part of the electoral reform movement to try to open up primaries like we saw here in Florida, to try to create more competitive districts through gerrymandering reform, ideas like ranked choice voting that we see in Maine, and I think another state adopted it on Tuesday. The idea is create greater competition among the candidates, or at least force the two major party candidates to begin to speak to the independents. And I think it's important that we always contextualize this electoral reform and the demands of independents in this way. It is not an attempt to punish the two major parties. If anything, it's an opportunity to strengthen them. Because if we can incentivize any candidate, but today we see candidates only from the two major parties, if we can give them an electoral incentive, a greater ability to win by speaking to independent candidates, because we have created open primaries or more competitive districts where they now need that broader coalition, I think we will have a better government. We will have more consensus-driven policymaking. In leading democracies that are multi-party democracies, meaning 3, 4, 5 parties, you have greater diversity of representation in policy and ideology and demographics among communities of color, among socioeconomic groups. You've achieved greater diversity of representation that actually looks like the country that we are. The open primary amendment that came up in Florida this year got 56% of the vote. It missed the 60% threshold. I think they will be back. And I think this is a movement that in the past 15 years has continued to grow and will continue to grow, including here in Florida.
Absolutely. I think you're right. Well, those are the questions that we have. I personally just want to thank everyone for taking time. If you have more questions or think of something else, we have a link to email David or I or anybody on the team with specific questions, and we just appreciate it. David, would you like to say anything else before we close out?
No, buckle up and hold on. And I guess what I would say, Amy, is this, because we were talking about this with Wendy just before this. Look, we can feel the division in the country right now, right? We know how politically divided we are. I would just suggest, consider whether or not we are simply divided politically or truly divided as a nation, because I don't believe the latter is true. I don't think we're divided as a nation. If you sit down with your family members, your colleagues at work, the person at the end of the bar, if you're not talking politics, we really are one people and live in the greatest nation on the face of the earth. So our politics are very divided right now. It doesn't mean we are as a people.
We are a great nation, and we will get through this for sure. Let me see. There may be one more. This is a question. How does an independent candidate get the ability to participate in the presidential debates?
So the presidential debates are controlled, the rules are controlled by the Commission on Presidential Debates. They set it, and it's typically a threshold of polls. You have to demonstrate, if you think of Ross Perot all the way back in 1992, I don't know the exact numbers, but as an example, I think you had to demonstrate you were polling at least 10% in 3 major polls. We have not seen a candidate like that, but we may very well see a candidate like that emerge in the future. You could make the argument that if Donald Trump had run as an independent, he may have been one of those candidates that could have gotten a spot on the debate stage next to the 2 major parties.
Well, and I didn't want to bring it up on this call at all, but the polling, that could change everything. I mean, we won't, that would be a whole other separate, yeah. We've heard a lot about polling, and does that industry, is that blown up or not? But we'll see, certainly. Well, thank you everyone again. Have a wonderful day. And thank you, David, for taking time.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.